Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been quite a miserable day today, so I hope you're sitting somewhere warm and cozy. And it gives me great pleasure this evening to show you a recording of a seminar that we made back in the summer with Sue Perkins. And I'm sure you're familiar with Sue Perkins, wonderful woman. And she was very kind and chatted to me about my book, A Passion for Fashion. And I'll play that to you in a moment. Now, what I'd like to say, although it's a recording, you do still have the opportunity to ask questions if you'd like to, so please do. You'll see you have a Q&A facility along the bottom of your screen, so use that and I'll attempt to answer any questions at the end. But for the moment then, let's get going and see what you think of the lovely Sue Perkins. Thank
you. This is a rather august day for me. I mean, people might know me for watching people watching ovens in an open-sided tent in an 80-mile-an-hour crosswind and occasionally screaming the word bake into their faces. But today I get to go up in the world and I get to discuss a passion for fashion and the history of costuming at Blenheim Palace with the wonderful Antonia Keaney. Hello, lovely. How are you?
I'm very well, Sue. It's lovely to see you. How are you?
I'm very, very good. I have to say, I have experienced some of the things that you talk about in your book directly, because I was lucky enough to be involved in a social history show for the BBC called Supersizers, where I was sort of primped and preened and shoved into various sort of costumes. Essentially what we did was we spent a week or 10 days in different periods of British history from the medieval period through to the 1980s. So some of the things that you talk about, which we'll touch upon later, I have direct experience of, and my organs have not yet recovered, I have to say. But the book charts the vagaries of fashion and how they basically impact upon Blenheim, which is a wonderful place that I had the good fortune to visit a few years ago. Whilst doing a VT for Bake Off. But where would you like to start? Where's a good jumping off point for you?
Well, I think given that it's Blenheim Palace, I think a very good place to start for us is always with the most famous Blenheimite of all, i.e. Winston Churchill.
Never heard of him.
Come on. You would have, I'm sure, seen his bedroom the day you went to Blenheim and had a little look at that cake.
Yes.
So, as I say, I think that's a very, very good place to start.
So you've got some slides that are going to take us sort of act as good sort of cues. So this is
actually going back. I need to go back a slide, so bear with me.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so there we are. As I say, very rude not to start with Winston Churchill. And I think as many people know, Winston Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace. He wasn't meant to be born there, but he was. He was very early. And because he was early...
Where was he supposed to be born, Antonia? Sorry to interrupt. Where was he destined to be born?
He was destined to be born in London, which is where his parents lived. But they were at Blenheim for a St Andrew's Day ball. And Jenny went into premature labour. And again, that's a whole different debate, in all honesty. But anyway, he was born at Blenheim nonetheless. And the picture in the top right-hand corner of the screen is Churchill as a little boy, aged 4. And I think most people, when they come to Blenheim, think it's a little girl. And
yes, because the ringlets and they're sort of things that rather erroneously we associate with little girls. But as you point out, the gender definitions of sort of long tresses and certain colours didn't apply in that period.
No, they didn't at all. And it was interesting. I was out walking with a friend the other day, and she was telling me about a book she was reading called The Burning of, I think, Bernadette Cleary or something similar. And she was burnt to death in Ireland in the 19th century because her family thought she'd been taken by the fairies. And lots of people have asked me, well, why did Victorian boys, why were they dressed as little girls? And not only was it easy for toilet training, so it was far easier to change linen underneath these wonderful smocks that they wore, but also the Victorians were afraid that the male children would be exchanged for malevolent spirits or fairies. And that's where the expression "away with the fairies" comes from.
You see, I was thinking how that's great. I was thinking, oh, that's how wonderful that there was this sort of single uniform that boys and girls had. But of course, social history being what it is, it was simply to protect the men rather than in any way to create a sort of balance between the sexes.
They were very important, obviously.
Well, they were the heirs, weren't they? And as you've subtitled it there, "Pink for a Boy," again, a very, very sort of important point here.
Yeah, I know things have changed, obviously, but it was always traditionally pink for a little girl. But in fact, in the Victorian era, pink was considered to be a far stronger colour, and this little pink dress did belong to a little boy. And as Churchill grew up, he developed his own style. And I just love this photograph at the bottom of him with Chanel, and she looks very chic, and he looks a little bit like a country bumpkin.
He looks like an exploded sofa, doesn't he? Bless him. I mean, that was one of the most striking things about the book. Actually, is obviously you equate Churchill, our wartime premier, with sort of global leaders and being cigar smoking and sort of bellowing and being a great orator. But he was really good friends with Coco Chanel. There was a side to him where he was very interested in and influenced by people from the arts.
Yes, absolutely. And his interests were so wide and so varied. But he clearly, once he'd escaped his mother's clutches, had no fashion sense whatsoever. And when
I'm like that.
Yeah, I think we all are. When he was married in 1908 to Clementine Hosier, there was a wonderful trade magazine called The Tailor and Cutter, and it describes him as looking like a glorified coachman. And it just goes on and says, we hope our readers will not adopt this style. And there he is with his creased sleeves and all the rest of it.
So what would a man of his standing be expected to have worn for his wedding?
I think something like that, but probably more fitted and probably, tailored and not borrowed from a family member or from his father or whatever. It's just, you just get the impression that this wasn't uppermost in his mind. And there's a wonderful letter. There are many wonderful letters between Churchill and his mother. And in one of them, they were quite strapped for cash. Relatively speaking, and it's dated kind of early 1900s, and it goes along the lines of something like, I quite understand it when you want to spend £200 on a ball gown, and I want to spend £100 on a polo pony. Huge amounts of money in those days. But he went on to say, the truth of it is we are both damnably poor. Now, his mother was clearly into fashion in a big way. Churchill was actually a very, very good polo player. So there you go. And
well, it's extraordinary to me that a ball dress is twice as expensive as a sort of prestige, pony for sporting events. Yeah. I mean, that's one hell of a ball gown, isn't it?
It is indeed. I mean, it's extraordinary when you think about it. Absolutely extraordinary.
And it still interests me that this idea that the male children were in pink, because I grew up and it was very much blue for a boy and pink for a girl. And for those who sort of moan and kvetch, now we're losing something, this all sort of new, as gender identity obviously is at the forefront of discussions, quite rightly.
Yeah.
That's, a great rebuttal to that traditional sense is actually, it's fabulous. Churchill was in pink. So stop it. Stop deciding that little boys have to wear one thing and little girls have to wear another. It's just a social construct, and it's
Yes.
and it's subject to change and to new imaginings. And I find that really heartening. Actually, it was a really interesting part of the book. Where are we going to next?
We are going to go back in time, in actual fact. So this is in fact, I should have just put in some incidental music there, I think, don't you?
So, Oni soit qui mal y pense, which is, so you people who think evil do evil. Am I translating that? Yes.
Yeah. Evil be to he who evil thinks. And it's the motto of the Order of the Garter. And this is the fourth Duke of Marlborough, who was Duke from 1758 until 1817 in his Garter robes. And the Garter robes haven't changed to this very day. And when you see the procession in Windsor, they're all wearing these magnificent velvet cloaks and carrying ostrich plumed hat, etc. But it's the suit underneath that's the real star of the show. And on the left is a typical court coat. And the men in the 18th century were every bit as colourful as the women, if not more so.
Yes.
And, you know, the embroidery, the richness of the thread, you know, gold thread, silver thread, solid silver buttons. But the thing I love about this photograph is that the man that had this made was quite a canny man. And can you see it's got the yellow plain bits on the front? And of course, he knew that you couldn't see those bits. And so, you know, why spend all that money on having fancy dancy bits when you don't need to see them?
Very clever.
Very clever indeed. And the other thing with his name was George, one of our many George dukes, is that he's wearing this amazing wig. And if we move on, the lady on the right is one of the many Lady Diana Spencers that belong, or that are cousins of the Marlborough family that live at Blenheim.
Yes. So the Spencers of Althorpe are related by marriage.
They are.
Maintain a strong connection with one another.
They do. So she was the sister of the fourth Duke, and she married this, the race represented by this paper sculpture, this chap called Topham Beauclerc. And you can see that he has everything that a dandy about town would wear.
For sure. I mean, the first thing that strikes you, and this is very much a Beau Brummel kind of vibe, is that there has to be an effusive frill at the neck, doesn't there? There has to be this sort of explosion of material, and the more the merrier. The bigger the fop, the bigger the frills, I guess.
Absolutely, or furbelows, or whatever you want to call them.
And it's a tight waistcoat as well, a tight coat rather than a more flamboyant affair.
Yeah, very tight, and again, a lot of these dandies were corseted as well. So that would help, you know, squeeze them in. And we'll talk more about corsets if we may a little bit later. But
of course,
it would help shape their athletic figure, certainly. But what I love about this in particular is the wig that he's wearing, and then in his right hand he's holding this little teeny tiny tricorn hat that can then just perch on top of it.
I mean, that would look, I mean, I say faintly ridiculous. It would look enormously ridiculous because, I mean, I don't even know his arms are long enough to actually get to the top of that periwig, to put this ludicrous little donut thing on top. But there's a lot of, the shoes are quite plain, aren't they, there? They're kind of, because I suppose the jazz hands, the main attraction is happening all around here and on the, what would you call these? It's kind
of a corsage, and you know, would have helped keep off the smells and goodness knows what else. But so just to go back to the shoes, his shoes are very plain, but the way they decorated them would be to use buckles. And again, the buckles could be metal, they could be paste, they could be diamonds, they could be, you know, whatever you wanted them to be.
Diamond buckles, my word!
Absolutely.
I mean. For most people, of course, walking the streets of London would be a fairly torrid affair, bearing in mind the rope and sewers. But you'd have to know that you had a strong carriage that was going to get you from A to B, and that you were never going to set foot on on a street, really.
Well, presumably you would have a nice strong footman to give you a piggyback through the street should anything happen to your carriage, because I'm darn sure you wouldn't put your foot in there.
But it's all sort of conspicuous expenditure, isn't it? It's all still very much that sort of aristocratic, let's get the bling on and with no shame just disport ourselves around town.
Absolutely. And in fact, the fourth Duke, who we just saw, had a very special servant called a running footman. And the running footman was employed to run in front of the carriage and announce that a very important man was on his way. But again, very handy if the carriage fell into a rut and he could, they were always very strong, very athletic. He'd be able to lift the carriage out and, if need be, carry the Duke through the muck.
So you write a lot about the livery and the cost of the livery involved in some of these, the footmen and various sort of attendees of these grand houses. But the running footman, as you say, was almost the peacock. So announcing in all the splendour that somebody really important was on their way. But there's also a terrible story about a footman who ran, was it from Windsor to London?
Yes, yeah. Well, the Duke challenged him to a race, and again, it wasn't unheard of. This was quite a common sport to either have races between carriages and running footmen, or between, I bet my running footman will go far faster than yours. And the poor chap expired at the end of it, but he did beat the Duke. But
I think that's the definition of a Pyrrhic victory, isn't it, really? It's something like 96 miles, and he was doing, wasn't it 11 miles an hour or something, he said? And he was,
something like that.
I mean, yeah, absolutely insane. So where are we going to next?
Well, we're staying with wigs just for a little while, because I think there's so much to be said about them. And so we saw Topham's wig. Now, some people had wigs and some people added to their hair. They had the equivalent of hair extensions as we would know them today.
Yeah.
But in Topham's case, he would put on his wig, and the next thing would be to put some grease on it. And the grease was there so that powder could be applied. And you would go into a special powder room, and you can see this gentleman, he's sitting with something to cover his jacket, and he's got this conical mask to his face, while the hairdresser is using his swan down puff to sprinkle the powder.
He looks like a womble in that. He looks like an aristocratic womble in that outfit. So they'd have so that their, as you say, their clothes and their faces would be protected, and it's bear grease they used.
That was the most popular. I mean, again, I think that was what the wealthy people used. I'm sure that the slightly lower orders would have just used any old grease that they could get their hands on.
Bit of lard or dripping or something.
Bit of lard or dripping, absolutely.
This powder, I'm assuming, like everything else of this period, would have been horrifically bad for your health. I'm imagining there are sort of dangerous particulates a go-go in this. The powder what was it made from?
It was made from, it was a starchy material, and it was very fashionable. And you did have to pay a stamp when you bought it. So there was a stamp duty, there was a tax on it. But again, I've read lots and lots of old newspapers of the time, and there was a story that because some powder dealers were a little bit unscrupulous, and they would mix the proper powder with all sorts of things. And this poor gentleman leant a little bit too close to a naked flame and discovered all too late that his powder had been mixed with gunpowder. And it literally just, the poor man died of his injuries.
It just exploded.
Well, it did.
I think that powder trader is beyond unscrupulous and has moved heavily into the sort of criminal zone, I think. There was a lot of adulteration there, wasn't there, in terms of, obviously foodstuffs, but also, as you say, cosmetics. Mm-hmm. So you also talk about how the introduction of what I suppose was a luxury tax on sort of beauty products was sort of phased out in the end, the wig, because they became too expensive to powder and maintain.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And a little bit like window tax and things like that. They were also taxed for toothpaste and tooth powder and, anything to do with personal hygiene, really, or fashion. So it was quite incredible, really.
So do we know how long that process would take? Kind of, you've got your hair extensions in, they need to be set with grease and then powdered. How long would a gentleman have to spend in advance of a do?
Well, I think a gentleman not so much, because theirs was fairly straightforward. But then if you look at the fourth Duchess, who's in the centre of this picture, now that's a whole different ball game.
That's a statement, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is indeed. But that's not a wig. And usually it's not powdered either. But she had all sorts of hair extensions, and it would, her hairdresser would create a frame and then add to it and titivate, etc. And she actually employed, so her husband had the running Footman, and she employed a French hairdresser. And I think this really sums it up beautifully. She paid him double what she paid her footman, and he every day would have been employed in dressing her hair, which is quite extraordinary, really, when you think about it.
And it looks like it's a sort of topiary set up there. He's got like a little step ladder, and it's sort of, and I don't know what the other guy, he's using some kind of surveying equipment there to sort of work out the angle of the weave.
It's a sextant, and and of course it gave rise to all sorts of ridicule, which is what this is. But what we did, we had an exhibition a few years ago, and what we did, we had this wonderful thing created. Let me just bring her into view, if I may.
Oh, look at that! That's beautiful.
Isn't that just wonderful?
3 galleons. That's what you need when you go out. 3 galleons on your head.
You do not only 3 galleons, but a few ostrich feathers, pearls, etc. But I just wanted, if I may, to do a little bit of show and tell with you, Sue, at this point. Yep. And bearing in mind, I'm just going to show you this lady again. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And I want you to look also at her face and her makeup.
Yes. Okay? Yeah.
So what do you think this would have had to do with fashion of that time? It's a mouse.
Well, I'm imagining that if you apply bear grease and then lots of starch and then don't ever wash your hair, I'm imagining that you can basically, your hair would be alive. At least I've heard that the hair was alive with rodents. Is that true?
It could be, or lice. And
you say that as if that's the more sort of beneficial option.
Well, or lice. With lice, I don't know if you can see these. You've got these little instruments, and you can just scratch your hair, and that's very nice. Look, little hands carved on the ends of sticks. But that's
women had to wait till the 1940s before they were allowed to cut their hair. Essentially, it took sort of the Second World War in order for and the land girl for women to go, oh, finally I can have a manageable do. So they would have scratches, yes. And that was the lice, and the occasional rodent outbreak.
No, but the mouse was used for something else. So again, I'm just going to refer you to this face. Okay, so it's very, very white.
Not the eyebrows.
Could be the eyebrows.
And the face is very white, so it'll be something awful. They'll basically powdered a mouse, won't they? Of course they will. They basically blanched and powdered a mouse.
I think they did use beetles occasionally, but no.
For rouge, wouldn't it? Yes, I suppose the was begins with a C, doesn't it? Cochineal, yes.
Yeah. So no, what would happen? Remembering that smallpox was quite a big deal as well. They used to use a lead-based powder to make their complexion white. Now, this would help cause your hair to drop out. And your teeth.
It would help your hair to drop out.
It would help it to drop out, absolutely. And so you could paint your eyebrows in. Sue, you're itching.
I am. I've come out in sort of, I don't know, sympathetic hives. The idea that the solution to smallpox scars would be lead is really very, very telling. So yes, they would pop this on with all its kind of cavalcade of health negatives. Yeah.
And do awful things. So you could either use the mouse's tail and shape it and stick it on, or you could just kind of cut him into shape.
So they'd basically flay a mouse, which is what the Mozart opera obviously was based on, and then they would stick a mouse pelt in the shape of a. I suppose the good thing about that is you can have different eyebrows for different facial expressions. So you could spend a whole ball looking surprised or sort of quizzical, or sort of horrific. And I know these heart-shaped sort of moles are called mouche, aren't they? Which is French for fly.
It is. There we are.
What was the? And you say something brilliant in your book about that, which is that it's almost like an early emoji.
Absolutely.
So it's this visual signifier. So what was the placement of the mouche significant? Or the shape?
The shape, so they would be made of either leather or taffeta or silk or satin or something like this.
Yeah.
And where you place them would indicate your mood, your political allegiance, etc., etc. So they told all sorts of stories with them, really.
I'm extraordinary. I'm amazed these women lasted a year. I mean, I know that the very heavy base, makeup was worn by Elizabeth, and her face, her teeth had fallen out, and all sorts of terrible side effects. You'd think that by this period, people might have just cottoned on that the foundation was not what it was cracked up to be.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Extraordinary, isn't it? And I presume the smell, I mean, not to be too graphic or too base, but thoroughly unpleasant. But I guess one acclimatised to it.
Yeah, well, I suppose they did, and they would have used all sorts of potions and things to try and mask that. But yeah, absolutely. Before we move on, can I just show you one more thing?
Yeah.
What do you suppose those are?
Right. Well, I mean, they look like the shape of scissors, obviously, but the tongs or something. Or is that about right?
It is absolutely right. And if we just go back to that slide, so the chap who's doing the tweaking, can you see that he's actually got a pair of these tongs, and he would have heated them over a little spirit lamp, and then teased the hair, which was either horse hair or human hair, into shape.
Because they bequeathed hair, didn't they? You'd get, grandma would die, and then you'd get a sort of metre of her hair sort of passed down.
Yeah. Or her wig.
Or her wig with galleons. So yeah, I mean, an early hot tong. I mean, you've got to commend their sort of powers of inventiveness. That's extraordinary.
They were extraordinary, absolutely.
Imagine now seeing these women. We would be so shocked. They would be so it's so overdone in this sort of into a modern sensibility. But that's amazing.
Did you not have to wear a wig for one of your?
Yes, as I was Marie Antoinette, so we did a French supersizers, and I had a very similar to the one that you just showed. Actually, I had a wig made, which was not a metre high, because in your book you say sometimes the wigs would be a metre high, but I had one that was pretty, I'd say probably 50 centimetres, and the weight of it was punishing. Really? So by the end of a long day, you would really, really, really feel the weight of it. You'd start to get sort of slight compression in your neck. And I remember doing a day where we just ate and drank. We'd eat and drink what was de rigueur at the time, and I was absolutely hammered, I'm afraid to say, and I had to do a piece to camera about women who would often sleep upright with their hair in boxes. I don't know if this was particularly a French aristocratic thing, but sometimes when the coiffure was so intense, they had another big do, they would just basically slump up against a wall, and a courtier would basically enshrine hairpiece in a box. So we did that. But it was so uncomfortable, and obviously it was pinned to me, and the pins would pull, and I know that wouldn't necessarily be the case, but they had, as you say, frames, and those frames would have to embed somehow into their natural hair, and you do look incredible. I mean, I had an 18-inch waist. I've never been happier, but it does come at a rather painful cost, I have to say. I mean, I know we're going to talk about corsets in a bit. I have an awful lot to say on that, but yeah, I do have first-hand experience of those things, and they are, yeah, damn, it hurts to look that good.
Okay, well let's move on to corsets. So these are the portrait on the right is one that hangs in the palace, and
Yes.
it's of the current Duke's grandmother, and it was painted in the late 1920s. And the portrait on the left is Winston Churchill's granny, and it was painted in the mid 1800s. And there's just over 80 years between the two of them. And between the two portraits, I should say.
Yeah.
And if you think we're now about 90 years on from when the portrait on the right was painted, so the dress that Duchess Mary's wearing is something that you could wear today. You know,
Yes.
it wouldn't stand out even 90, 100 years on. Whereas if Mary were to dress in what Churchill's granny's wearing, she would just have looked ridiculous. So things haven't changed as much in the past 100 years, I would say. There have been changes, but not quite as much. The thing that interests me, without being indelicate about the Duchesses, is what they were wearing underneath. And this is typically what Duchess Mary would have worn. So you've got French knickers on the right-hand side, so made of satin, so very, very beautiful against the skin, very comfortable. Hand embroidered. And interestingly, I suppose they were made to be seen in a way.
Yes.
You know, as opposed to the Victorian linen bloomers and all the rest of it, which weren't quite as beautiful. And on the left, you've got a camisole, and at the bottom, a bust minimizer. Because again, the fashions of the day were very straight up, straight down, very androgynous in terms of shape. And so that's what Duchess Mary would have worn underneath her dress. And a lot of the time, it's all about forcing, and again, particularly with women. I know that I said earlier that some of the 18th century men would have worn corsets, but it's particularly women that have to change their shape to fit in, you know, and more often than not, especially at those times, it would have been a man designing how he thought the female shape should look.
And with the dandies, there's a sense that it's by their own agency. There's no societal pressure on those men to put on a corset. It's simply we feel tribally affiliated to this sort of aesthetic, and so we volunteer to put our bodies in this sort of restrictive cage. Whereas you say with women, it was just a societal norm, and that's what they did. And from a very, very early age, they were trussed and bound. And you know, I often sort of think about foot binding and Chinese traditional culture and the outcry about that. But our own social history is full of physical contortion done in the name of fashion and tradition. Mm-hmm. And as you say, it was entirely the men saying, actually, this century, we'd like our women to have this shape. And usually, well, for a lot of it, a tiny waist, and almost like that sort of, like you're sat atop an enormous toilet roll, you know, that kind of huge crinoline. And when you, as you say, when you get to the 30s, it's hellishly freer. Oh, there you go. So this is what we're talking about.
Yeah. So on the left, well, this is the sort of thing that Duchess Duchess Frances would have been wearing in the Victorian times. And the corset on the left gave a 19.5-inch waist. And you were saying that you had worn something similar to that.
Yes. And it took two very, very experienced. I mean, I was very lucky during the making of that show. We worked with two costumiers who were absolutely at the top of their game and worked on a lot of period costuming. In fact, I think one might have worked on Pride and Prejudice, more of which later. But they knew their onions, and I was in proper kit, and it took both of them pulling with all their might, pulling and pulling and pulling to configure my body. And I was a lot lighter then than I am now. I was certainly. I was not carrying a lot of extra timber, but even so, it was painful. And you feel your ribs starting to just slightly shift, and certainly your organs displacing, even just in 10 days. And when you take off the corset, you have these welts across your body. And again, these were original corsets, and they were padded, and they had, the whalebone had linen around it to try and protect you. But even so, I mean, it did feel like being in a clamp. And you look, once you're in it, your posture's incredible. That's the only good thing I can say about it. I naturally am a real sloucher, but once you have that support in your core, you feel like you own the world, because you just glide in and out of places and you're completely upright. But boy, did it hurt. And looking at that, it's awful, isn't it? I mean, it's like a sort of fanciful Iron Maiden, really.
Did you eat while you were wearing it?
Oh, huge quantities. I mean, when I was Marie Antoinette,
in terms of comfort, how was that?
Awful. So when we did the French version, so we did the French Revolution. When I was Marie Antoinette, I didn't eat very much, because despite the fact she's credited with, let them eat cake, she didn't say that, and her own appetite was scant. And she was so sort of traumatized and sad most of her life. She probably had what we'd now deem an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. But when I was back in the UK and we did the Victorian episode, I was eating an awful lot. There'd be banquets, and you're putting away 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 calories a day, and it has to go somewhere. So sort of in the end, I'd end up with this sort of uniboob, where sort of essentially my sort of stomach, which was inflating, sort of rose. So this unsettling kind of sort of jellified layer kind of popping up above. But it was, and I had weird aches and pains for months afterwards, which I don't really know what I'd attribute those to, but it was not a pleasant sensation, and you almost lose track of whether you're full or not, because your stomach's not in the right place. Everything's defying gravity and sort of pinned in. So I presume over time, I mean, that's serious damage you're doing in one of those.
But have a look at that.
Oh.
So that's the wasp waist, which again was desirable at a certain stage. It's just, and there are really early kind of X-rays, I think, of women with these organs that, as you say, are completely displaced. If you think you wore yours for a relatively short time, imagine wearing that for years and years and years.
And they started them young, and actually they would deform the body. So that, that when that corset came off, the body wouldn't go back to that. It would still have that. It wouldn't quite be as restricted as that, but it had been trained into that sort of. Oh God! I mean, that's just awful, isn't it? That is. There's nothing good to say about that, really, because one should never have to sacrifice one's health and longevity for a sort of fashionable whim, but that's exactly what that is, isn't it? What's the cartoon on the bottom right? God, look at their waists there.
It always gave rise to cartoonists and things like we saw with the wig, and this is just meant to be a comical view of the extremes that people would go to lace themselves into these really, really tight corsets.
But you think of, again, it's whimsical. It's that Victorian sort of aesthetic, whereas before in the sort of the Hanoverian, the sort of thinking Empire line, and I mean I'm certainly not a social historian, so forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, but a much looser affair, much freer. I mean, I think there was an element of corsetry there, but it certainly wasn't.
Nothing in comparison. And also before these kind of extreme, more Victorian corsets, ladies would wear stays. Now, I just want to, again, just do a quick kind of show and tell. Have you come across one of these before?
What is that?
It's
I know it's going to be something awful. I don't know.
No, it's not. I promise. I'll stop.
Is it where they a steak where they just hammered in the corset?
Yeah,
So
if they wouldn't put their corsets on, they just used to bash them.
Yes.
Yeah. So before, in the 18th century, they would wear stays, which were kinder, and they, although they looked narrow, they kind of just smoothed you round a little bit, as it were.
Yeah.
But you mentioned how good your posture was when you were wearing your corset. Well, with the stays, they used to pop this down the front. It's called a stay bus. And so there'd be a special pocket at the front of it, and you'd just pop it down there, and it would keep you nice and upright. And because it was worn close to the heart, again, I don't know if you can make it out, it was carved with all sorts of love tokens and things. And so it would be given by a man to his wife or mistress or whatever as a token, as a love token. And
nothing says I love you like a sort of a wooden stake, a posture stake. But I mean, within the context of it being sort of probably quite painful, that is it. I love that about history when you see these engraved, personalised little artifacts. Yeah, she was loved, and boy was she upright.
Absolutely. Well, one of the duchesses, the ninth duchess, who was an American lady called Consuelo Vanderbilt, she was corseted, and you mentioned starting them off very young. In her memoir, she writes about when she was a child, her mother used to sit her with a metal rod down her back and leather straps to keep her upright, which in a way is more like even more like a medieval form of torture. So it's just astonishing, really.
I should imagine she just longed for the day that social services was invented, because that is just extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, for goodness sake, don't educate your women, but do teach them to sit upright by, basically chaining them to a stick.
Yes.
So those are some more examples there of those beautiful stakes.
We'll move on.
I might treat myself and put a light on. Am I disappearing into the gloom? Shall I put a light on?
Yeah.
Or am I all right? All right.
I think you're okay, but yeah.
I'll go and do that.
Okay.
Right.
Gosh, that's much better.
Good. I was carried away, so I sort of
This is just on the right hand side there. You can see hoops, which were the precursors of crinolines, and a hoop would have been worn under a dress called a mantua. And again, just to show you the beautiful fabric, wealth, etc., etc. So that's just a little clip on that. But
here we go.
I just can't help it. I'm so sorry.
No. So I sense we'll be discussing this at length.
No, we won't. It's just a little. So when we had this exhibition, everything in it was a period piece, except for these breeches. And I needed a pair of breeches just to kind of illustrate what men would wear. And this is what men would wear next to their skin. So it's the equivalent of someone standing there in their boxer shorts and their vest. And the breeches belonged to Mr. Darcy, to Colin Firth. And they were the joy of my life for 3 months. But
you would just look upon them and
I just stroke them gently every day.
Yeah.
I do.
Why not? But that's why it's such a great moment, and it was so well done in that particular iteration, because it's very intimate for a gentleman to be seen. I mean, that shirt should always be covered.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And it was not sort of socially acceptable. Neck. Yes, yeah, you're allowed to see the neck. So you have fulsomely touched Colin Firth's breeches.
I have.
I love the fact that you felt. I love that you chased that down for the exhibition. I think there may have been alternative motives, but it's good that they were there, and you get to, and it's quite a thing actually for you to have had those. They were quite the talking point of probably one of the most talked about moments in television of that decade, I imagine.
Absolutely. Anyway, we'll move on. So we've kind of talked about corsets and the terrible damage that they did. And there were so many things that were very, very dangerous for people who followed fashion. Um, the arsenic bolts at the top left there. Paris green was a very popular colour during Victorian times, and Paris green was produced by the addition of arsenic to the dye. Wonderful. So as you wore it, your skin would absorb the arsenic on the fabric. And of course, the poor souls that were employed in factories dusting, kind of little artificial flowers with green powder containing arsenic, they suffered beyond belief.
Of course, there was no unions there. There was no sort of workplace representation or tribunals. So these poor girls would just sort of fall sick. And in one case, I know you mentioned die, and plausible deniability. They could just say, "Oh, well, it wasn't the dye. It wasn't the." So for people that had a Paris green dress, the symptoms would be they'd while the dress was on, they'd presumably have local irritation and
sores and things like this. And again, that was the thing. If you were removed from the source of irritation, it was fine. So factory owners just let it carry on pretty much. And it was, again, women for the most part. They would just tie their aprons up to cover their nose, a bit like we do now. We go into shops and things. They covered their nose and mouth, and that was all they could do. But it was dire, absolutely.
So what's Johnny Depp doing there in his finery?
Well, Johnny Depp played the Mad Hatter. And beaver skin was used. You say about mouse skin, when you think about it, there were so many skins that they used in fashion and still do. So beaver skin hats were very fashionable. And you needed to separate the fur from the skin. And it was done with a process called carroting, an orange paste that contained mercury. And the mercury would give off vapor, and it would affect your sanity sooner or later, hence the Mad Hatter.
So they think that's what the Mad Hatter had mercury poisoning?
Yes, yeah. And hatters did die of mercury poisoning.
And that was it was felt, wasn't it? Was so a felt hat was originally made from beaver skin.
Yeah.
And at the bottom, I mean, that's one hell of a statement piece. But there's a lot of danger in having a skirt that's as wide as that.
Yes, I mean, it's exaggerated, but if you look back through past copies of the Times, again in the 19th century, there was a continual liturgy of disasters involving crinolines. So you had open fires, you had open flames for light. So if your wig didn't catch fire, then the chances are that your crinoline would. And the way the crinolines were made, they act like bellows. So their wire was fabric around them, so they would compress and they would literally fan the flames. They'd get caught under carriages. They'd get caught in machinery in factories. But there is one story.
There's nothing to commend them, Antonia.
No, absolutely. I mean, nothing. Absolutely. I suppose the only thing is you could wear your pajamas underneath and no one would know. But absolutely nothing at all. I remember there was one gentleman wrote to the Times, and he was thoroughly incensed because he had a pew at the church and there wasn't room for him to sit in it when crinolined ladies also sat in the pew because they just took up so much room. He was completely beside himself.
It's not their fault. I mean, I have to say the one thing I would say that I remember learning about crinolines, which did commend them to me, was certain gardens were developed so that you'd have lavender, but quite woody, thick, very aromatic lavender bushes placed just shy of the full width of a crinoline, so that when ladies walked through, their rough sort of skirts would brush up against and then release this vapour, which I thought was very romantic and lovely, but not romantic and lovely enough to sort of offset the huge amount of pain and agony they went through in wearing them. But yes, they are. You're right. They are like sort of bellows, you know, because in trying to get away, you just introduce more oxygen, which would then compress. And
absolutely. I mean, literally, you could be completely aflame in about 2 minutes.
Especially if someone had put gunpowder in your wig.
You were doomed. There is a happy note. There was one happy story.
Thank goodness for that.
So Martha Shepherd, a young lady, decided she was going to end it all by flinging herself off the bridge into a river. And she was wearing a crinoline, and it acted like a parachute, so that a passerby was able to fish her out of the river and take her to safety. So that was rather nice.
That is good. I'm going to hold on to as our one positive crinoline story.
Right, I think we should. I'm just very conscious of the time, so if I may, I'm just going to quickly run through this because I'd really, really would like to talk about Dior.
Yes, of course.
And this is in 1896, so the time of the 9th Duke and the American lady I mentioned, Consuelo Vanderbilt.
Yes.
They would have house parties, and again, the women. It was easy for men in terms of clothing. They would be out shooting and wear, you know, their uniform, as it were. Women had to have at least 4 changes of clothing every day with the appropriate underwear and accessories and things. And for a 4-day stay, then that's 16 outfits, and you weren't expected to repeat an outfit at all.
Well,
you know, it's just
ludicrous.
It's bonkers, isn't it?
Yeah, it is bonkers. Exactly that.
Yeah. But again, just moving on, we had great fun with shoes in the exhibition, and the pair in the top right-hand corner there go right back to the early 1700s in actual fact, and they were made of satin. And shoes at the time weren't made for a left or a right foot. And the shoe you can see at the bottom has gauche written in it, so left. So as you wore them, you would put a little sticker or write in them or indicate which foot you generally put them on, which was rather nice.
And that centerpiece, the shoe there in the cabinets, is in your book. There's a bigger photo, zoomed in photo. It is the most stunning shoe I've ever seen.
And that was called the Marie Antoinette.
And for people that, well, they can refer to the book, but the clasp is an embroidered head, isn't it, of Antoinette? So she's sort of slightly looking down, and the main element of the clasp is this huge wig, and it's so beautiful.
It is. And she actually had, a couple of ships in full sail on that buckle as well, which was rather nice.
Absolutely.
And the fact that there's then a portrait of Louis XIV just above her, and with his very fancy dancy shoes as well, it seemed a good place to put her.
He's very pleased with his calves, isn't he? He's getting those on display.
Oh, yes.
Delighted with himself.
Right.
So that was...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So that was specially sent to you, wasn't it, that shoe?
Yes, it was. So because of the Louis XIV connection and the fact that he liked to wear red heels, and he actually decreed that it was only nobility in France that were allowed to wear red heels, it made me think of Christian Louboutin with his red soles, which are a trademark. And so I eventually managed to find the right person to speak to. And I said, is there any chance we could have a pair of shoes? And they were absolutely fantastic. And they said, yes, of course you can. And they said, well, would you like us to send you a catalogue? And I said, yes, that would be nice. And I'm expecting a little teeny tiny catalogue.
PDF or something, yeah.
Absolutely. And this great big leather-bound book arrived. And we just sat and flipped through, and really they're works of art. They're not just shoes.
Yes.
And came to the Marie Antoinette, and I thought, well, it has to be this. And they were great, and they said, we'll send you a pair from Paris, you know, from our headquarters, from our archive. And then they emailed and they said, we're terribly sorry, the shoes are broken, we can't send them. And I said, oh, okay, but we have got some in the UK, we'll send you those. Absolutely fine. And then I had another email saying, we've lost one of the shoes. And it just carried on and on. So in the end, we ended up with one shoe, and it was perfect.
I have to say, I think as a single item, it's just, yeah, it's giddying. It's lovely.
It is indeed. Yeah. So we met the Lady Diana in the middle before.
Yes.
So she was a Lady Diana Spencer. The lady on the left, now, can you see, if you see her shape, she's wearing stays. And as I say, it still looks very severe, but if you see her sideways on, she actually would have looked quite normal.
Yeah.
So that was fine. But I wanted also to just acknowledge the relationship with Lady Diana Spencer that we're all more familiar with. And the year we had the exhibition was actually 20 years since she died. And so I managed to get in touch with this lovely lady called Christina Stambolian.
Yes.
And she very famously designed what became known as the revenge dress. And we had it in the exhibition. Christina loaned us a couple of her sketches. And she was, we're still in touch. She's such a lovely lady. And she said that Princess Diana came into her boutique in Kensington with her brother. And she was just looking for, you know, a cocktail dress.
Mm.
And she bought or ordered this dress, commissioned this dress. And then Christina didn't see it, you know, because do you remember at the time, everyone would photograph Diana and whatever
Wherever.
she was wearing.
Yes.
And then it was the night that Prince Charles acknowledged that there were 3 people in the marriage. And it was the night of Diana's first solo engagement at the Serpentine Gallery. And this is what she wore. And that's what made the headlines.
What an extraordinary way to announce Christina on the world stage as well, and that, because it was
absolutely
probably the most photographed dress of that time. But maybe Liz Hurley's might be creeping up, the Versace safety pin dress. But that, absolutely. Yeah, I love the idea of a revenge dress. That the idea that you're slighted or sad, and you go out and you just dazzle.
Oh yes, absolutely. It's the way forward.
I might go for a revenge jogger. I'm slightly revenge onesie. I think it's more
revenge sweat. You see a onesie, Winston Churchill's invention. Back to the beginning.
Yes, I was just thinking. I was sad we hadn't mentioned that, and now we have. It's good. Yes,
absolutely. So Coco Chanel, no influence at all as far as fashion goes. Just went ahead and invented his onesie.
Nothing wrong with a utilitarian one piece. That's all I'm saying. So we come to almost the crowning glory of
we have
of the thing, which is something I didn't know about, to my shame, which is the very strong connection that Blenheim has to Christian, the House of Dior, essentially.
We do indeed, and this is a relatively recent photograph. So in 2016, Dior launched their cruise collection for spring/summer 2017, and the palace was closed for 2 days, and you can see that the chairs are all beautifully laid out, and we have this amazing catwalk in the long library. And it was a day when it was pouring with rain, as it always is on these occasions, but it was a day when every celebrity of the fashion world, etc., was invited. And they actually chartered the Orient Express to go from Victoria Station to our local station. And they brought all these celebrities, and then there were limousines to bring them to the palace, and they took their seats, and these very stern-faced models paraded their dresses. And the whole thing, guess how long it took?
10 minutes?
12. 12 minutes. And it was staggering, absolutely staggering.
That's extraordinary. Blink and you miss it. But then, as you say, different with Dior because those pieces form part of an archive, but with so many fashion shows, it just blink and miss it. So yeah. What a location!
What a location! But we have history with Dior. So they didn't choose to come to Blenheim randomly. In fact, what they did was to hark back to the 1950s. And do you remember Duchess Mary that we saw in that black dress? So that's Duchess Mary. She was a huge supporter of the Red Cross, and she raised money for them throughout her life. And she was president of the local branch of the Red Cross. And you can see her here with Princess Margaret, who was guest of honour at the fashion show that she organised in 1954.
And she's wearing, I think, the last beavers in Britain, the ones that haven't been carroted.
Absolutely. Then she had it made into a hat. No, she didn't. So, 1954, Christian Dior came and he showed haute couture dresses and gowns and things. And it took well over an hour to parade and show all these wonderful things. It was so successful, it raised about the equivalent of £250,000. And you would have paid 5 guineas to attend, and you could attend, you know, it wasn't by invitation only.
Oh, that's good.
It's very good. I mean, 5 guineas was quite a lot of money in 1950.
Of course. But the fact that it at least sort of notionally was open to all and that it had a charitable arc was great. And that is his protege on the right, isn't it? That's Yves Saint Laurent.
It is. So it was so successful in 1954 that they repeated the exercise in 1958. And Dior had died the previous year. So you're quite right. That's Yves Saint Laurent. Princess Margaret is the guest of honour again. And Duchess Mary's just leaning over her shoulder to give her some instruction, I dare say.
Is he photobombing?
Quite possibly. But what I'd like to do, if I may, is to just show you, it's about 2 minutes film of that 1958 show. And I think some of the things to look out for are the fact that the models are smiling, because in the 2016, they just had such stern, strict faces, as I'm sure they were told to do. The models are all smiling. And if you look at the audience, all the ladies are wearing hats, except for the family members. So the Duchess isn't wearing a hat, and her daughters aren't wearing hats. So all the ladies, I should say, and her daughters aren't wearing hats because they're at home. But there was a wonderful report in the local paper, and it said that because people had bought tickets to come to this, then the Duke and Duchess weren't at home to them. So, you know, there was no kind of going up and saying, "Hi, Bert, how are you?" But one last thing before I do show you the film. The other thing was that for £1, you could buy a raffle ticket, and the winner of the raffle ticket won a Christian Dior dress.
Which would be worth an unimaginable amount of money now.
Unimaginable. And it was won by a tenant farmer, apparently.
That's great. That's the happy ending everyone wants.
Absolutely.
Oh, man, that's great. So this is some archival footage of, this is the second show, sorry, with Yves Saint Laurent, is it? Or is it a compilation?
No, it's just a quick snippet with commentary. So, ready? Let's go.
Come on, let's hear that old commentary.
Let's hear that old commentary.
At Blenheim Palace, a royal occasion. Princess Margaret received a bouquet from 8-year-old Hilary Coates, and the fabulous presentation of the Dior winter collection began. It raised money for the Red Cross, and the princess was the guest of the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough.
Oh, sorry.
1,650 people paid 5 guineas each to benefit the charity, and see what the great fashion house of Paris plans for the smart woman this winter. What a setting for a fashion display. A short evening gown with chic and style, such as only the House of Dior, according to the House of Dior, can give. Here, another evening gown, this one for the great occasion. The 16 mannequins, 2 English girls among them, modelled 136 creations all told. Quite an evening's work. Another short evening ensemble. If one gown could be singled out from so many, perhaps it was the happily named Blenheim, a superb, long evening dress. Dior himself is dead, but in the world of haute couture, it's the king is dead, long live the king. Now the great man's mantle is worn by Yves Saint Laurent. Her Royal Highness congratulated him on the magnificent display. Then he presented the models to the princess at the end of a most memorable evening.
Fabulous.
Wasn't that magnificent?
Absolutely fabulous, that. And it all made all the more special by the fact that, you know, people could, if they had them, you know, if they could raise the 5 guineas, they could come and see it. And it was so polite as well. And then this sort of high-level sort of paparazzi, it was all just rather, oh, I like that. It was really lovely, really, really lovely.
I don't know if you noticed there was a lady in the audience smoking as well.
Have they learned nothing from social history?
I know.
I learned nothing. So is that the end of your slides?
It is. I have.
Is there anything we've missed out on? I don't want to. I want to make sure that we've covered everything before we bid farewell.
There is a question has popped up from a Cordelia Keaney, and it says 2 questions. What's your favourite item of clothing kept in the Blenheim archives, and what is the most valuable piece? Now, it's an interesting question because we don't actually have an awful lot in the way of clothing in the Blenheim archive.
No.
So we have some servants' liveries from the late 1800s. But possibly my favourite thing is a recent thing that I can actually just quickly show you. And it's the wedding dress that was worn by Lady Blandford, who, oops, sorry, let's go.
Him.
So this is the wedding dress worn by the Duke's daughter-in-law. And it's absolutely stunning. It was made by Dolce & Gabbana, and the reason history was made is that it was actually the first wedding dress that they made in the UK for a UK bride. And it was made in the traditional way, so it's a skirt and a bodice rather than a dress. And again, it's heavily boned and all the rest of it. So it was actually, you know, it's quite an interesting thing and incredibly valuable.
Yes, I imagine. I like the idea of nuptial separates rather than the one dress. That is gorgeous. Yeah. And made in the UK. And that a departure, they're not using Dior but Dolce & Gabbana, but again a very venerable, a bit more modern fashion house. Any more questions coming through from our beloved viewers?
No, let's have a look. No.
Maybe you've sated their curiosity so perfectly they don't need to. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much for sharing everything, not only from the book, but also the show and tell. And I will have some of those lice scratches if you could just... Lovely. You wouldn't mind sending them.
Would you like me to send you a mouse?
I have some here, actually, which I must sort out. But yes, should my eyebrows need sort of... I don't know, some more expressions, then yeah, I'll make sure that's the way I go.
And a few badges.
I've got Catherine Nathan has said, who is my favourite designer? Do you know what? I'm in my slightly, I mean, I may well get there again, but in my slightly slimmer days, I was a huge fan of Dolce & Gabbana because they did do wonderful women's tuxes. They're really good. But as does Hugo Boss, I have to say. But Dolce & Gabbana have a very, I don't know, they have a very sort of big place in my heart. But a lot of the time, I'm with Winston Churchill, as I say. I'm all about the onesie. I'm all about the zip it up, the uni bag that you can just sort of trundle along with. Add a mask to that, and I'm fully accessorised. Thank you for sharing with all of us your knowledge and expertise. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Sue. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise. And now, in this new world where everything is done remotely, we have the awkward moment of signing off.
Yes,
this is now this where we struggle to find the buttons. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Kevin. Thank you to people who are now sort of being sweet enough to sort of send in their thanks. I hope to see you in the real world one of these days soon. And stay well.
I have a puppy I need to show you. So
yes.
if that doesn't get you to Blenheim, I don't know what will.
Oh no, I'm there. I mean, right. I just COVID regulations withstanding, I shall be there. Thank you guys. Take it easy.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. It was lovely to listen to Sue again. She was such good fun, and she was just wonderful. But all that remains is for me to wish you all a very happy Christmas. And if you're at a loose end next Wednesday, then join me again and hear about how my colleague Kate Ballinger is looking forward to deep cleaning the palace. Good night.